All right, so you've got all this information on security screen doors and these three-point locking systems, but how do you make sure your home security is truly rock solid?
It's a lot to wade through.
It really is. And that's why we're doing this deep dive going from the ins and outs of manufacturers like Lockwood and Whitco to those pro tips from the lock mob. And because what good is a fortress door if it's not installed right, we're going to tackle installation too. Sound good?
Let's do it.
Perfect. So what fascinates me is how these systems can take something as simple as turning a key and turn it into this like multi-layered defense system for your home.
It's quite ingenious when you think about it.
Yeah,
You're basically taking a simple action and translating it into this really robust form of protection. And I think that's what makes three-point locking systems so effective.
it's like a secret handshake, but for your door.
Laughs. I like that.
So we've got Lockwood and Whitco on our radar. They're both big names in the security door world, and they both offer these three-point locking systems. But what actually sets them apart? What are we looking at here?
Well, for starters, they both have their own unique features and innovations. Like Lockwood, for example, they have this DualSelect feature. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I saw that. What is DualSelect? Is that like a dual climate zone, but for your door?
Not quite. But I can see why you'd think that. It's actually really clever. It's like having two locks in one.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
So you mentioned you sometimes leave for work in a rush, righty?
Every day.
Well, with DualSelect, a single key turn switches from safety mode when you're at home to this full secure mode when you're away. No more double checking if you locked up properly.
That would actually be life-changing. See, these are the kinds of things I need. And they also have this lock alert feature. Is that like a little voice that says, you're good to go?
I wish. No, but it's a visual indicator on the lock itself. So no more second guessing. If you remember to turn that key, you'll know at a glance if that door is actually secure.
Speaking of clever features, I noticed Whitco's Tasman escape lock has something called an anti-jemmy feature.
Oh yeah, that's a great
Now
one.
that sounds intense. What exactly is a jemmy?
So imagine a burglar's least favorite tool. It's essentially a crowbar, but this anti-jemmy feature makes prying the door open a whole lot harder.
Music to my ears. I mean, these are great, but they're kind of useless if they're not installed correctly. And I'm seeing a lot about triple lock adapter kits and making sure the cutouts are deep enough during installation. That seems pretty crucial.
You are 100% correct. This is where things get really, really important. Because if those cutouts aren't right, you're not getting that full three-point security benefit.
Right, so it's like having a five-star general, but giving him a water gun to fight with.
Exactly.
And this is where our friends at the Lock Mob come in with their expert advice. And they hammer home the importance of nailing that installation. In fact, they give you step-by-step instructions to test if your lock is even working correctly.
And they're so good at explaining everything in a way that anyone can understand. It's not just about buying the lock, it's about understanding how it works and ensuring it's actually providing the level of security you need.
Right, it's like they're giving you the secret decoder ring to unlock a whole new level of home security. So what are some of these tests that we can be doing ourselves at home?
Well, they have this really cool method where you actually start with the door open.
Wait, really? That seems counterintuitive when we're talking about locks.
Right, it sounds strange, but bear with me. So, step one, you open the door and you pull down on the door handle as if you were closing it. But here's the key, don't touch the handle again after that initial pull.
Okay, so we've got it primed, but not fully engaged.
You got it. Now look for that small trigger. It's usually above the main locking tongue on the lock body itself. Pressing that trigger engages the main tongue into the ready-to-lock position, even though, remember, that door is still wide open.
So we're basically just simulating that locking action in a controlled environment.
Exactly. Now, and this is where it gets really neat without touching the door handle again. Use the internal snib to lock the door. You should feel all three tongues engaging smoothly.
Ah, so we're listening for that satisfying clunk as each tongue locks into place. We're doing this with the door open for a reason, though, right?
You're catching on quickly. This open door test, it establishes a baseline for how the lock should feel and sound when it's functioning correctly.
So you're creating that sensory memory of a perfectly functioning lock.
Precisely. So now close the door and repeat that exact same locking process using the internal snib.
And we should be feeling and hearing that same smooth, unrestricted engagement of all three tongues.
Exactly.
That is such a good tip.
And if it feels different or it sounds different at all, like there's any resistance or a change in the sound, it could mean there's a problem with your installation. especially with those cutouts in the door jamb.
Which we talked about before. Those are absolutely crucial. Now, you also mentioned something about actually marking the locking tongues to double check the depth of those cutouts. Can you walk us through how to do that? Okay, so walk us through this tongue marking technique.
It's a lot simpler than you think.
Hmm.
With the door open and that locking tongue engaged, you just make a little mark on the tongue itself with a pencil.
Creating a visual guide for how far it should extend when it's fully locked.
You got it. Then you close the door and check if the pencil mark lines up with the edge of the cutout in the door jamb. If it doesn't, the cutout's not deep enough, which means that tongue isn't fully engaging. And that's when you know it's time to grab your tools.
That's a great tip. These lock mob guys really are on top of their game. Okay, we've been talking a lot about the locking mechanisms themselves, but what about the actual doors these locks are going on? Not all security screen doors are created equal, right?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
There are definitely some key differences to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about the types of locking systems they can use.
So what are the main types that we should be aware of when we're shopping for a security screen door?
Well, the most common ones you'll see are hinged doors and sliding doors. Hinged doors are pretty self-explanatory. They're like your typical door attached to the door jamb with hinges. Pretty straightforward. And because of that classic design, they can accommodate either single-point or three-point locking systems.
So you could technically have a basic single-point lock on a hinged security screen door.
You could, but if you're going for maximum security, a three-point system is the way to go.
Makes sense. Now, what about sliding doors? I know you mentioned you were a little concerned about someone potentially lifting your sliding door off its tracks. Do the locks on those address that at all?
They do.
Yeah.
And that's actually a great question because it brings us to some of those extra features that can really take a security screen door from good to great, like anti-lift mechanisms. Have you heard of those?
I have. But remind me how they work again.
So imagine someone tries to lift your sliding door out of its tracks. An anti-lift feature is designed to prevent exactly that. It usually involves extra locking points or mechanisms that secure the door to the track, making it almost impossible to lift out.
So they're addressing not just the obvious entry points, but those sneaky workarounds that a burglar might try. Love it. Are there any other features like that? Hidden security measures that we should be looking out for?
Absolutely. One thing people often overlook is the strike plate. You know, that metal plate on the door jamb where the locking tongues actually engage.
Right, they don't seem very exciting, but they're
Right.
important.
And some manufacturers offer these specialized strike plates that are like little fortresses themselves. They're made from hardened steel designed to resist drilling or sawing. So even if someone managed to get past the lock itself, they'd hit that extra layer of protection.
It's like that saying, good, better, best, never let it rest until your good is better and your better is best.
Laughs. I like that. And some even have interlocking plates that create an even more secure connection between the door and the frame. It's all about those small but mighty details.
Okay, let's talk more about installation. We know it's crucial, but what are some of the most common mistakes people make that the lock mob warns us about? What should we avoid?
Oh, where do we even begin? I'll tell you one thing, those cutouts for the locking tongues, it seems like a small detail, but getting those right is
I
crucial.
mean, it seems so easy to mess up.
It is, which is why they really emphasize using the locking tongue itself as a guide to mark the depth. That way you're guaranteeing a perfect fit every time.
Smart. Now, what about the type of screws? Is that as important as they make it sound?
Absolutely. It's another one of those seemingly small details that can make a world of difference. Think about it. If you're using screws that are too short or flimsy, you're basically securing your door with toothpicks.
So what kind of screws should we be using?
The Lock Mob recommends going with heavy-duty screws, at least 3 inches long, made from hardened steel. These are the real deal, designed to resist tampering.
Okay, good to know. So I'm noticing a theme here. Both Lockwood and Whitco, they really emphasize using their specific adapter kits and following their installation instructions to the letter.
And for good reason. Those kits are designed to make sure their locks work perfectly with a variety of door types. They've done all the engineering legwork for you, but you've got to follow their recipe if you want that security success.
Right, deviate from the recipe and you're on your own. What about aligning the lock and strike plate? That's going to be pretty important too, eh?
100%. Even the slightest misalignment can throw things off and affect how smoothly that lock engages. The Lock Mob, they have a great tip for this. They suggest using shims, which are those thin little wedges, to fine-tune the lock or strike plate until they line up perfectly.
It's like they always say, measure twice, cut once.
Exactly. It's all about precision, just like a well-oiled machine.
Speaking of well-oiled, what about maintenance? What are some easy things that we can do, aside from not using them to pick our teeth, to keep these locks in tip-top shape?
Right. Regular maintenance is key. It really is. And it doesn't have to be complicated, but those small efforts can go a long way in preventing those dreaded malfunctions.
So where do we even begin?
Well, if you have a sliding door, keeping those tracks clean is priority number one.
Right, because that buildup of dirt and grime can really make it harder to slide, which can't be good for the locking mechanism.
Exactly. Something as simple as vacuuming the tracks regularly and giving them a quick wipe with a damp cloth can make a world of difference.
And I'm guessing some lubrication is our best friend here, too.
Absolutely. A little silicone-based lubricant, just a little bit, on the tracks, the rollers, and the locking points can do wonders. It'll reduce friction, it'll minimize wear and tear. It's like giving your door a spa day.
Okay, so silicone-based, that's key, right? We don't want to use anything that's going to attract more dirt or gum up the works.
Exactly. Now, for both hinged and sliding doors, it's a good habit to get into regularly inspecting those locking points. Look for any signs of wear and tear, any damage, or if anything seems misaligned at all.
So those telltale scratches or dents, or if it just doesn't feel as smooth as it used to.
Exactly. Catching those little issues early on can save you a lot of headaches, not to mention expenses down the road.
Right, because even small problems can turn into big ones if you ignore them long enough. So if you do spot something that seems off, it's probably best to just call in a professional locksmith sooner rather than later.
100%. They have the experience, they've got the tools to diagnose and fix any issues before they turn into major security risks.
Now, speaking of professional help, are there any scenarios where calling a locksmith is just the smartest move right off the bat, even for those of us who, we like to think we're pretty handy?
That's a great question. And while there are definitely a lot of aspects of security screen door maintenance and even some minor lock adjustments that you can handle yourself, there are definitely times when calling in a seasoned locksmith is the most sensible and the safest option.
So when should we resist that urge to tinker and just go straight for the locksmith's number?
Well, a jammed lock is a big one, especially if it's your main point of entry. Forcing it could damage things further and turn a minor annoyance into a much bigger, more expensive problem.
It's like those stubborn knots. Sometimes the more you pull, the worse they get.
That's a great analogy. A locksmith will have the right tools and the know-how to get that lock unjammed safely and effectively without causing any further damage. So unless you're a trained professional yourself, attempting to pick or force a jammed lock is a big no-no. Another situation where a locksmith is your new best friend is if you suspect your lock has been tampered with in any way.
What are some signs of tampering that we should look out for? What are some red flags?
Things like scratches around the keyhole or a handle that feels loose, or if the key just doesn't turn as smoothly as it used to, those are all signs that something might be off.
So even if the break-in wasn't successful, those signs mean the lock's integrity could be compromised.
Exactly. And in those cases, it's always better to be safe than sorry. Get a professional to assess the situation.
Now, on a slightly less intense note, how do you go about finding a good, trustworthy locksmith? Because I imagine entrusting someone with your home security, that's a big deal.
Oh, absolutely. It's like finding a good doctor for your door. You want someone skilled, reliable, and someone you feel comfortable with.
So how do we find that perfect locksmith? What are some things to keep in mind?
Well, word of mouth is always a good starting point.
Yeah.
Ask friends, family, neighbors, see if they have any recommendations. Those personal referrals can be really valuable.
It's all about that trusted network. What about online reviews? Are those helpful at all?
They can be, but it's always a good idea to take them with a grain of salt. Look for consistent positive feedback, especially when it comes to things like professionalism, reliability, and fair pricing. And don't be afraid to dig a little deeper. Check out their website, see if they have any professional certifications.
Because locksmithing is a skilled trade, right?
Exactly. And reputable locksmiths will often be members of professional organizations, like the Master Locksmiths Association, which means they adhere to a certain code of conduct.
Okay, so we've got our recommendations, we've done our research. What happens when we actually contact the locksmith? What should we look out for?
Pay attention to how they communicate with you. Do they actually listen to your concerns? Are they upfront about their pricing? Do they pressure you into any unnecessary services? A trustworthy locksmith will be transparent, they'll answer your questions clearly, and they'll make sure you understand everything.
Transparency is key.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And remember, it's always a good idea to get multiple quotes from different locksmiths before you make a decision.
That way you can compare prices, services offered, And that gut feeling, trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Now, as much as I love geeking out over locks and doors, I realize we've only scratched the surface of this topic.
There's always more to explore.
Always. So before we wrap things up, any final thoughts on where this whole world of security screen doors and locking systems might be headed? What's next? What does the future hold for keeping our homes safe? Are we talking futuristic doors with lasers and fingerprint scanners here? Give me the inside scoop.
Well, maybe not lasers just yet, but things are definitely moving in a more, shall we say, intelligent direction.
So smarter than your average smart lock.
Much smarter. Imagine this. Your smart lock isn't just a standalone device, it's part of a whole network. It's talking to your alarm system, your security cameras, maybe even your motion sensors.
So it's like a whole security team, but for your house.
Exactly. And it's all working together to create this, web of protection around your home. And the best part is with AI and all these advancements, these systems are becoming more intuitive. They can learn your habits, recognize who should be there and who shouldn't, and detect anything fishy going on.
So if it notices something weird, like someone trying to pick the lock in the dead of night, it could trigger an alarm, send me a notification, maybe even alert the authorities.
Exactly. Like having a 24/7 virtual security guard.
That sounds pretty incredible, I have to admit. But are there any downsides to all this? Like, we're putting a lot of faith in this technology.
You're right to be cautious. Like with anything new, you have to weigh the benefits with the risks. With smart home security, cybersecurity is a big one.
Right, because the more connected something is, the more vulnerable it might be.
Exactly. Just like you protect your computer and earphone, you need to make sure your smart home security system is locked down tight. That means choosing reputable brands, strong passwords, and being really careful about who has access.
So it's not just about installing it, it's about using it smartly.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got cybersecurity. What else? Oh, data privacy is another valid concern. These systems are collecting data about your comings and goings, your routines. You want to make sure that information is protected?
That's a really good point. Before I sign up for anything, I'm reading those privacy policies with a fine-tooth comb.
Always a smart move. Make sure you understand what data they're collecting, how they're using it, and if you have any control over it.
Knowledge is power, right? And speaking of, this deep dive has been amazing. We've gone from the simplest lock to the future of home security in what feels like minutes.
Time flies when you're talking about door hardware.
It really does. So for our listeners out there, whether you're going old school with a classic three-point locking system or diving headfirst into the world of smart security, remember that the most important thing is to be informed.
Couldn't agree more. Do your research, ask those questions, and stay safe out there.
Well said. That's a wrap on this deep dive into security screen doors and how we keep our homes safe. Until next time, stay curious and keep those doors locked.